In Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, the 1927 Yankees lineup featured the greatest 1-2 punch in the history of baseball. Ruth hit a record 60 home runs, and Gehrig hit 52 of his own, also driving in 173 runs. Today, Jaws ranks Ruth as the #1 right fielder of all time, and Gehrig #1 at first base. Just think about that for a moment. Opposing pitchers had to deal with two players named baseball's all-time team. It's no wonder they called this lineup Murderer's Row. Ruth was larger than life, as indicated by his 23 nicknames. I mean, who in the world has 23 nicknames? That alone is what we may call a Ruthian accomplishment. When you look at Hall of Fame measurements, he's ranked #1 by Black Ink, Hall of Fame standards, and Jaws. Upon retiring in 1935, the Babe held a ridiculous 56 Major League records, including his record 714 home runs. Today, Ruth still holds over 30 Major League records, including slug, OPS, OPS+, and total WAR. Because of his 2,130 consecutive games played streak, Gehrig was called the Iron Horse, a record he set despite suffering through a reported 17 fractures in his hands. Writers often called Gehrig Larapin Lou, describing him as a batter who delivered a beating to opposing pitchers. And today he still holds over 30 Major League records, including the AL record for most RBIs in a season, and he's the only player to total 500 RBIs over a 3-year span. While Murderer's Row featured what we may call the Great Two in Ruth and Gehrig, the Big Red Machine featured the Great Eight with 4 Hall of Famers in Rose, Morgan, Bench, and Perez. Like Ruth and Gehrig, Bench is rated #1 by Jaws at his position. Named to MLB's all-time team, Bench was Rookie of the Year, a 2-time MVP, and the MVP of the 1976 World Series. With over 1,600 RBIs in his career, Perez was a model of consistency. He was the MVP of the '67 All-Star Game, taking future Hall of Famer Catfish Hunter deep in the 15th inning to lead the NL to victory. In Joe Morgan, the Reds had what Sports Illustrated called the game's most complete player. Morgan was the MVP of the 1972 All-Star Game and the National League MVP in both '75 and '76. Rose, of course, is Major League Baseball's all-time hit leader. He was the '63 Rookie of the Year, a 3-time batting champion, the '73 NL MVP, and the MVP of the 1975 World Series. When people discuss the greatest lineups of all time, these 5 are often mentioned among the elite. You'll notice the criteria we're using as we move forward in this video. As we compare legendary lineups, first, the lineup has to have won the World Series, and second, the lineup has to feature a minimum of 3 Hall of Fame position players. While Murderer's Row is often considered one of the greatest lineups of all time, as you can see here, the Baseball Writers Association of America only voted in Ruth and Gehrig. By contrast, Jimmy Foxx's Athletics have 3 players, as do the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers. Of course, if Rose had been elected, the Reds would be the only team to win a World Series that featured 4 Hall of Fame position players. But if you count the total Hall of Famers in each lineup, which would include those voted in by the Veterans Committee, then both Murderer's Row and the Brooklyn Dodgers have 4 players. Again, if Rose had been elected already, the Reds would already have 4 players, and if Dave Concepcion would someday be elected, the Reds would then have 5. Here's a snapshot of MLB's all-time team that was announced in 1997. I mentioned it earlier in the video as Ruth, Gehrig, and Bench were all named to this team. And here's a look at the all-century team that included 100 players. Once again, Murderer's Row only has Ruth and Gehrig listed, but the Athletics, the Dodgers, and the Reds all have 3 players. And the all-century team was reduced to 30 players by the fans. Both Murderer's Row and the Great Eight still feature 2 players. And I think it's fun to see how various sources rank the greatest players of all time. So I pulled 5 pretty recent lists out there. And as you can see, the Athletics have 3 players on one list, the Dodgers have 3 players on 2 lists, but the Big Red Machine has Bench, Rose, and Morgan on all 5 lists. As we do a deeper dive on these lineup comparisons, we'll note that there are 17 World Series champions that featured 3 position Hall of Fame players. There are a total of 14 teams, as a few of these lineups won multiple championships. We've already looked at 5 of these lineups, but there are 9 more lineups to consider. And here's a look at the Hall of Famers in those 5 legendary lineups. It bears repeating that Rose must be on this list, as we know he's a Hall of Fame talent who would have been a first ballot Hall of Famer if it were not for the gambling. For the purpose of comparing legendary lineups, Rose must be included. What I've done here is add up the JAWS rankings for each player in a given lineup. So for example, if Bench is the number 1 rated catcher and Morgan is the number 4 rated second baseman, then you have a total of 5. When you add up all 8 players for the Reds, you have a JAWS total of 442. It might be a little shocking to see that Murders Row comes in last on this list, again showing the strength of Ruth and Gehrig, but not necessarily the strength of the rest of the lineup in comparison with some of these other legendary lineups. As we consider these 9 other lineups, the first thing you'll want to make note of is the 32 Yankees, which also featured Ruth and Gehrig. In total, there were 6 Hall of Fame position players in this amazing lineup. This graphic also shows us that some of these players are repeated in various lineups, players like Gehrig and DiMaggio and Bill Dickey. And here's the other 4 lineups to consider: the 51 Yankees that featured Mantle and DiMaggio, the 66 Orioles, the 93 Blue Jays, and the 96 Yankees. It's pretty interesting to look at the Blue Jays and the Yankees because they feature players that we really don't even identify with those teams. Baseball Reference doesn't even picture Rickey Henderson or Paul Molitor with the Blue Jays, and they also don't picture Wade Boggs or Tim Raines with the Yankees. Nevertheless, according to our criteria, these lineups have to be examined. And here's where it gets real interesting. The 32 Yankees have a JAWS total of only 259, and they have 3 players that rank in the top 10 and 7 players that rank in the top 50. When we look at the totals from these 14 lineups, only 4 of them come in with a JAWS ranking of under 500. The 32 Yankees top the list with 3 players in the top 10 and 7 in the top 100. The Reds have those same numbers. Besides Ruth and Gehrig, what stands out is that the Yankees also have 7 players in the top 50, whereas the Reds only have 6. But this is just the beginning of our analysis. Now let's look at WAR according to Baseball Reference. As we look at the 5 legendary lineups, we see that the Great 8 comes in first on this list with a total WAR of 440.8. All 8 players have a WAR of at least 10, and 4 of the players have a WAR of over 50. Murderers Row comes in second on this list. And here are those other 9 lineups, and look who tops the list. It's those 32 Yankees again. They have a total WAR of 546.9, which of course is greatly attributed to the greatness of Ruth and Gehrig. And here's a summary of the Baseball Reference WAR rankings. There were 5 lineups that came in with a WAR of over 400. The 32 Yankees top the list, but the Reds' numbers look very similar. But of course, it's Ruth and Gehrig who pushed the Yankees to the top of this list. Because some people prefer Fangraphs WAR, I went ahead and took a look at that as well. When you look at the 5 legendary lineups, it's the exact same order as Baseball Reference WAR, with the Great 8 on top and Murderers Row coming in second. And as we finish with the other 9 lineups, the 32 Yankees top the list again. The big difference is that the number 2 and 3 spots have been flipped from what we saw earlier with Baseball Reference. And as we look at the Fangraphs WAR rankings, we see the same 5 lineups that have a total WAR of over 400. Once again, the 32 Yankees top the list with the Great 8 coming in second. The big difference is that the bottom 3 teams have been jostled around, with Murderers Row moving slightly up the list. I really like how Baseball Reference has a 7-year peak for WAR, so I took a look at that as well. Among the 5 legendary lineups, the Great 8 tops the list, and Murderers Row just edges out the 55 Dodgers. Maybe the most astonishing thing we see here is that both Ruth and Gehrig had a 60 WAR over this 7-year peak. To put that in perspective, that's more than Tony Perez had in his entire career. That's just crazy. And here's the 7-year peak for those 9 other lineups. The 32 Yankees top the list, followed by the 38 Yankees and the 93 Blue Jays. Here's the summary of the 7-year peak for WAR. This may be one of the more interesting summaries that we've looked at so far. The 32 Yankees top the list, but it's DiMaggio and Gehrig's 38 Yankees that come in second. Of course, for all practical purposes, this is Gehrig's final season, as he only played 8 games during the 39 season before he was forced to retire. And by Gehrig's standards, a 4.7 WAR in 1938, well, it's good for most people, but not really for Gehrig. The Great Eight come in third on this list, with Murderer's Row coming in fourth. We looked at Jaws, Baseball Reference WAR, Fangraphs WAR, and the 7-year peak for WAR. There's 2 interesting takeaways when you look at these summaries. Number 1, of the 5 legendary lineups, the Big Red Machine's Great Eight is the only team to make the top 3 in any of these categories. And number 2, it's the 32 Yankees who are at the top of each list. I've added one more layer of analysis to these summaries. There were 4 things that we ranked with Jaws, Baseball Reference WAR, Fangraphs WAR, and 7-year peak WAR. The 32 Yankees were on each list coming in first. If you add those totals together, the Yankees have a number of 4. The Great Eight is the only other lineup that was on all 4 of those lists. Their total is 10. The 38 Yankees come in third, and astonishingly, the Blue Jays are 4th on this list. As crazy as it seems, 6 position players from the 32 Yankees got in the Hall of Fame. 3 of them got there by the Veterans Committee, but still, 6 players is 6 players. Since few of us were around in 1932, I thought I'd provide a little information on some of the players in this lineup. Joel Sewell played third base, and his best years were definitely behind him in 1932. He might very well be the greatest contact hitter in the history of baseball. He only struck out 114 times in over 8,000 plate appearances. I mean, that is just ridiculous. And he still holds the lowest strikeout rate in Major League history, striking out only an average of once every 73 plate appearances. He once went 115 games without a strikeout. In 1932, the Babe was 37 years old. He was beginning to show some signs of decline, but he still led the league in RBIs with 130 and an on-base percentage of .489. He posted a WAR of 8.5, not bad for a guy who was 37 years old. Bill Dickey was just beginning to hit his peak. His best years were definitely ahead. And Frankie Crosetti, he was just a rookie in 1932. Here are the greatest players in those 2 legendary lineups. The 32 Yankees featured 6 Hall of Famers in Ruth, Gehrig, Dickey, Combs, Sewell, and Lazzari. They're the only team that can boast 6 position Hall of Famers. And of course, the Great Eight had Bench, Morgan, Perez, Rose, and maybe someday Concepcion will get in through the Veterans Committee. Here's a look at the lineups. Just imagine the Yankees going 1 through 6 with Hall of Famers at each position. But the Reds have a lot of star power of their own. Hitting in the 6 holes, George Foster, who won an MVP, was runner-up another year, and led the league in RBIs for 3 consecutive seasons. As we revisit those ranking lists that we looked at earlier, only Ruth and Gehrig appear from the 32 Yankees among the top 100 players of all time, whereas the Reds boast Bench, Rose, and Morgan on all 5 lists. Here's some more comparison between these 2 lineups. When you look at the left 2 columns, it's pretty even. We already know that Ruth and Gehrig helped tip the scales in the Yankees' favor when it comes to WAR, but the Yankees also take it in total runs, triples, home runs, RBIs, walks, and extra base hits. But the Reds also take some categories like seasons played, games played, hits, doubles, stolen bases is a really big difference, and even total bases. But when we look at the right 2 columns, the Yankees really do stand out. They have 7 players in the top 500 all-time in batting average. That's just one example. I mean, look down at OPS. They also have 7 players there in the top 500 all-time. The Reds do get the edge when it comes to power speed, but overall in those right 2 columns, the Yankees do show their greatness. At this point, it seems as if the 32 Yankees have the edge, but the real test is, who would you take at each position? So we're going to systematically walk through each position one by one. As we go around the horn, we have a battle of 2 Hall of Famers at the catching position. Bill Dickey was a great player. He's ranked 8th by Jaws at the catching position, and he was an 11-time All-Star. But I think we all know this is a slam dunk for Johnny Bench. As we move to first base, we have 2 more Hall of Famers. Perez was a 7-time All-Star who drove in over 1,600 runs. But once again, this isn't much of a contest. This easily goes to Gehrig. With Lazzari being voted in by the Veterans Committee, At second base, we also have two Hall of Famers. Jaws ranks Lazaria as the 30th best second baseman of all time, and he has a WAR of under 50. Whereas Jaws ranks Morgan number 4 at second base, and he has a WAR over 100. This is a pretty easy decision for Morgan. As we move to third base, we have the all-time hit king in Pete Rose versus Joe Sewell, probably the greatest contact hitter of all time. Sewell was a great player. He had over 2,200 hits and a lifetime on-base percentage of .391, but it's not much of a match with Rose here, as Rose is the all-time hit leader and a 17-time All-Star. We're going to skip over the shortstop position for now, and since the Reds are leading at the moment 3-1, let's just jump to right field and get this over with. I love Griffey. He played 19 years and has over 2,100 hits, but who are we kidding? This has to go to the Sultan of SWAT. With that behind us, let's move to center field, where we have another lopsided decision. In Geronimo, we have a 4-time Gold Glover, and according to Baseball Reference, his range factor as an outfielder ranks him as the 5th best of all time. Nevertheless, he's up against a Hall of Famer in Combs, who has a total WAR of 45, whereas Geronimo's is only 13. This easily goes to Combs. And now we're tied 3-3, with Bench, Morgan, and Rose for the Reds, and Ruth, Gehrig, and Combs for the Yankees. It comes down to shortstop and left field. In Crosetti versus Concepcion, we have the first real difficult decision to make. Crosetti played 17 seasons and collected over 1,500 hits. Rogers Hornsby even said he was the spark plug of the Yankees. But as we take a look at this, it's pretty clear that Concepcion gets the nod here at shortstop. Concepcion leads in virtually every category. He has over 2,300 hits, almost 400 doubles, almost 1,000 RBIs, and he has over 300 stolen bases. His WAR exceeds Crosetti, as does his 7-year peak. In fact, Concepcion has a good case for the Hall of Fame and may one day be enshrined. As we compare his statistics against other Hall of Fame shortstops, we can see that he is definitely a deserving candidate. Concepcion played more games at shortstop than 15 players currently in the Hall of Fame. He even had more hits than 12 of them, more home runs than 14 players, more RBIs than 12, more stolen bases than 15, and the list goes on and on. He definitely has a good Hall of Fame case. The only rub against Concepcion's case are some of the Hall of Fame metrics that are used. While Hall of Fame Monitor says that he is a likely Hall of Famer, most of the others say that he's not. But I've digressed because the point of this comparison is to see who wins the shortstop position, and the Reds do take this and now take a 4-3 lead in this matchup. If the 32 Yankees want to challenge the Great Eight as being the greatest lineup of all time, then Ben Chapman is going to have to beat George Foster in left field and tie this thing up 4-4. This is going to be the most challenging comparison yet. As we look at the careers of Foster and Chapman, we can see this is going to be a difficult decision. I've listed 29 different categories for us to look at, but to give you an idea of how close some of these are, they're only separated by 33 hits, 34 runs created, and Foster just barely edges out Chapman in Baseball Reference WAR by 1.4. Chapman takes the stats that are often associated with good leadoff hitters. He's leading Foster in hits, batting average, runs, walks, on-base percentage, and doubles. Chapman was also faster, and he takes OPS. He was a 4-time All-Star, but of course the game began in 1933. He wasn't even eligible the first couple years. It's very plausible to say he would have been at least a 5-time All-Star. Foster, however, takes most of the power stats. He takes home runs, RBIs, total bases, extra base hits, slug, OPS plus, and runs created. He also played a couple more years than Chapman, and he sweeps all of WAR, regardless of what you look at, and all the Hall of Fame measurements. He was the 1977 MVP, the runner-up the year before, and also a 5-time All-Star. We'll call that even with Chapman. And according to Black Ink and Hall of Fame Monitor, Foster is also a borderline Hall of Famer. In fact, while the Hall of Fame Monitor says that Dave Concepcion is a likely Hall of Famer, when we consult all of the Hall of Fame measurements, Foster's case is actually stronger. But our main point, of course, is that Foster edges out Chapman in left field, and the Reds win this comparison 5-3. Earlier, when we were comparing the career statistics of these two lineups, the 32 Yankees seemed to have an edge. So how in the world do the Reds take 5 positions when we compare them one by one? Well, you probably know the answer. It goes back to what we talked about at the outset. It's the Ruth Gehrig factor. This is probably the greatest thing about WAR. It enables us to sift through all the endless statistics and come up with one good measurement. Ruth and Gehrig have a crazy WAR total of 275.9. That's just including Ruth's WAR total as a position player. And that's what matters since we're trying to determine who the greatest lineup of all time is. By comparison, Morgan, Rose, and Bench only have a total WAR total of 255.2. And I say only because we're comparing them to Ruth and Gehrig. This is really mind-boggling when you look at it. I mean, we know how great Ruth and Gehrig were, but their WAR total is greater than Morgan, Rose, and Bench put together. I mean, it's just crazy. And that's what explains why initially the 32 lineup of the Yankees looked like it could be better than the Big Red Machines. But of course, as we did a deeper analysis, it's clear that that's just not the case. So there you go. The Great Eight is indeed the greatest lineup ever assembled that won a World Series and featured a minimum of 3 position Hall of Famers. Thanks so much for watching, and I really appreciate it when you like and subscribe.